behalf of the Islamic Scholarship Fund, I wanted to welcome everyone here and thank everyone for coming. It's always very heartwarming and encouraging to see the type of support that we're getting, even though we're a fairly young organization. So thank you again for coming out. Before we get too far down the road, I wanted to thank our host here, the De Anza College, and the crew that's here. We're in, I should say, historic De Anza College, and I don't know if many people realize this is where, you know how Steve Jobs comes in and does the Mac show at the Moscone Center and unveils the new product, and 20 minutes later it's obsolete, you gotta buy the new one? Well, he unveiled the Macintosh right here. So this is where Mac was unveiled, and I was told that Reza didn't want to be outdone by Steve Jobs, so he's going to unveil his own version of iPhone 6 tonight with a built-in application for anti-Islamophobia that you can launch right away. Before I forget, wanted to mention that tonight's program wouldn't have been possible without the generous contribution from our sponsors, so I want to take time to thank them publicly, and this is not in any particular order. So our sponsors were Graduate Theological Union, some of you may know them as GTU, the Center for Islamic Studies, the director, our brother Munir Jiwa is here, and Amana Mutual Funds, Zaytuna College, which inshallah soon will be the first accredited Muslim college in the United States, MCA, Muslim Community Association of the Bay Area, Islamic Culture Center, Northern California and Oakland, where I believe we had our first fundraising, South Bay Islamic Association, West Valley Muslim Association, Yasin Foundation, and Ilum Magazine and Foundation. So please join me in giving them a warm welcome, and thank you. Thank you very much. So we have a good program for you tonight. Hopefully you'll enjoy it as much as I will. The lecture will start in about 5-10 minutes, and we'll have during the Dr. Aslan's program, there'll be some volunteers that'll walk up and down the aisles, and they'll hold up like a 3x5 card. So if you have any questions you want to ask, if you're not shy, you can just get up and ask questions. If you are shy, you can write it down, and we'll collect the questions and have about a 30-minute question and answer session after the program. And then afterwards, we'll have a book signing outside. So books, Dr. Aslan's new books, and there'll be a book signing and a little bit of a photo opportunity. So inshallah, that'll be around 8:45 to 9:15. And they'll kick us out here at 10 o'clock. So for some of you that may be a little unfamiliar with Islamic Scholarship Fund, just wanted to give you kind of a 2-minute background about who we are and what we do. Our goal is to, Islamic Scholarship Fund was actually founded to address the problem that Muslims are underrepresented in the fields of studies and professions that we believe are the most important fields affecting public policy and public opinion. So these are, as it relates to college degrees, these are humanities, social sciences, liberal arts, and law. And our goal is to be able to encourage more Muslim students that are going into these fields, because we want to have more Muslim lawyers, more Muslim filmmakers, journalists, writers, academicians, and I'm talking about homegrown academicians, and including people in the fields of Islamic studies, Arabic studies, public policy, conflict resolution type of fields. So the reality is that we simply want to have a seat at the table. A seat at the table in a country where we live, and we want to be able to have some kind of effort in a way to effectuate our own outcome. And our message is very simple. Our message is simply a message of integration, because we believe it's through integration that Muslims can really assimilate themselves in the fabrics of the society and become a normal functioning part of the country, again, that we live in. And it's also through integration that we think that it's the best way to foster further understanding of non-Muslims and our neighbors about the Islamic faith and those who practice it. And our message is exactly that. Our method is really through, we believe we do that through education and scholarships. And our product is Reza Aslan, or the Reza Aslans of the world, because we believe that it's really through the support and creation and encouragement of the Reza Aslans of the world that we believe we'll be able to ultimately address the two things that we're trying to address, which is people and access. Having the right people in place to be able to speak on our behalf and having access to the forms of media that will allow us to give us our side of the story. So, and before I forget, there was a great interview that was published. They interviewed Dr. Reza Aslan on Mother Jones. So you can either go to Mother Jones and read it, or we'll put the link on, excuse me, we'll put the link on our site at the Islamic Scholarship Fund. It's a great article. I think you'll enjoy it. So, without further ado, I'm going to give you a brief introduction about Reza Aslan, a man of the hour. I'm sure you came here to see him instead of me. He's the founder of AslanMedia.com. It's ASLANMedia.com, all one word, an online journal for news about the Middle East and the world. And he's the author of No God But God, The Origins, Evolutions, and Future of Islam, and How to Win a Cosmic War. Published in paperback, Beyond Fundamentalism, Confronting Religious Extremism in a Global Age. He's also the editor of the anthology Tablet and Pen, Literary Landscapes from the Modern Middle East. Among others, and he also serves as the member of Council on Foreign Relations, the Los Angeles Institute for the Humanities, and the Pacific Council of International Policies. He's a professor of creative writing at the University of California in Riverside, and he lives with his wife and his 2 sons in Los Angeles. So I also need to tell you that it was about 20 days ago where his wife gave birth to twin boys. So the fact that he's here, we should be very happy. So please give him a round of applause.
It's very nice to be here. I'm going to see if this works here. My name is Reza Aslan. I am a jihado-fascist Islamic supremacist. In case you all were wondering, I'm simultaneously a secret Iranian agent working to bring down America, and a secret American agent working to bring down Iran, which is pretty impressive that I can do both at once. No, Hamid, thank you very much. It's really great to be here. This is, of course, home for me. I grew up in the Bay Area, as I think a lot of you know. Went to Del Mar High School, went to Santa Clara University. That's right, Broncos. And now I live in Los Angeles, and we'll just let that one go. You know, I was asked to. It's a great honor to be here. By the way, Hamid's right. My wife and I just gave birth. I like to say we gave birth as though I had something to do with it. We gave birth. It was very difficult for me to twin boys, but you know, I really wanted to be here because this is an incredibly important event, and it's an incredibly important organization, as I'll talk about in a minute. So I was asked, actually, to come and talk about 10 years after 9/11, right? 10 years after 9/11. This is the discussion that we've been having over and over again about what's changed, right? 9/11 changed everything. That was the cliche that we heard for the last 10 years. Of course, it's important to understand that unlike most cliches, which are cliches because they are true, this is one of those weird cliches that also happens to be totally false. I mean, I've been trying to think about this for the last, 3 or 4 months. All these news magazines, everybody wants to talk about this subject, about what has changed in America, how we have changed since 9/11. And I'm racking my brain, and I can't really figure out what has actually changed. I mean, if you remember, we were talking about political unity after 9/11, right? We were going to put aside our differences. We're going to put aside our political differences. We're going to come together as a nation, united under this banner of American identity. How'd that go? That lasted, I'd say, about 2.5 weeks before we started going after each other on not just the most mundane issues, but also on this kind of this anesthetizing political debate about national security that ultimately became the definition of the 9/11 generation. We were going to have this global awareness. Do you remember this one? A lot of you guys, man, I see a lot of young faces, and now you were probably like 6 or 7 when 9/11 happened. But I'm talking to the older people in the crowd here. Do you remember this? Do you remember this? We were all going to be globally aware. We were going to know where Indonesia actually is, right? We were going to know who the president of Malaysia was going to be. This was the key promise about 9/11, that we suddenly realized that the rest of the world matters, what happens in other parts of the world actually matters in the United States, and by God, we're going to make sure that we understand what's going on. Yeah. Right. Did not go so well. The role of American Muslims. It's hard to remember that there was a time where the government and the FBI and the CIA and the military all agreed on this one fundamental premise, which was that you cannot win the war on terror unless you have the American Muslim community on your side. Do you remember this? I mean, I went from like meeting to meeting. You know, I would go to DC, I would talk to the Homeland Security, I would talk to people in the CIA, I would talk to people in national security. They would all say the same thing over and over again, that this is a battle that can't be won with just guns and bombs, that we have to have the American Muslim community behind us. That's our greatest weapon. You have this community that's fully integrated, that's loving life in the United States. They're the ones who are going to win this war on terror. Yeah, and then that same organization that said that we, American Muslims, are the forefront on the war on terror, began to like bug our phones and bug our mosques. Didn't work very well. And then this is the one that always gets me. The 9/11 generation. The kids who today are, you know, in their early 20s, a lot of you are out there. This was the generation that was going to be known as the 9/11 generation, the generation that was going to change everything, that was going to change the way that America worked in the rest of the world, that this generation was going to be socially active, politically conscious. You know, we thought that it was going to be this new generation. We were talking about building some kind of new version of the Peace Corps in order to put some of this social activism, this political consciousness that was arising amongst the youth of the 9/11 generation, which today, 10 years later, probably, you know, knows more about Snooki than Saleh. Well, actually, I know more about Snooki than Saleh, so that's not really saying all that much. Nothing, as far as I can tell, none of the promises about 9/11 have actually borne fruit in any way. In fact, I honestly, I've been racking my mind about this for the last few months. I cannot think of one positive way, not a single positive way, in which this country is better 10 years after 9/11. Not safety-wise. This is an argument we're not about to have right now because I'm not interested in it. But this argument about are we safer, you know, or since before 9/11, or are we more safe now, or are we less safe now? That's an argument to be had, you know, in another way. But one thing that is very clear is really the changes that you can think about when it comes to this issue of safety have primarily to do with the steady erosion of civil liberties. And for what? For the illusion of safety. Because if I take my shoes off before I get on a plane, then we're all safe. The illusion of safety is what we've gotten. As I say, a polarizing political sphere and a situation in which what was once supposed to be our greatest asset has now become a real pariah in this country. Mainstream Islamophobia that I'll be talking about in a moment. What has changed since 9/11? You know, one can say that, well, you know, that's because it was during the Bush years. And the Bush years, you know, are years, you know, actually it's funny because I was going to say Bush years are better left, you know, in the past. But the more I see the Republican field, the more I kind of miss George Bush. Does anyone else miss George Bush all of a sudden? How did George Bush become like this moderate guy, you know? I will say something about George Bush. Yes, he had an evangelizing foreign policy. Yes, he understood the entire universe in terms of good versus evil. Yes, he did more probably to destroy America's image abroad than any other president. But he was not a bigot. That's the thing about George Bush that I miss. He was not a bigot. He would not allow the kinds of sort of anti-Muslim rhetoric that has become the core of the GOP. He would not allow a peep of that while he was in office. But it doesn't matter. We got rid of Bush. We have our own, a new president, Barack Obama. It was supposed to be great for Muslims because now we actually have one of our own in office. It's just a joke, everyone. But nevertheless, this was the promise, that the bookend of the 9/11 generation was going to be Barack Obama. And yet, this is the thing that's absolutely just mind-blowing to me, is that today, in 2011, America's perception in the Arab world is worse than it was under the Bush administration. Don't believe me? Take a look yourself. Far, far worse off. These are the positive views of the United States in these Muslim majority states in the Middle East. Look at Egypt. Egypt, a country that just went through an incredible democratic revolution. 5% positive rating for the United States. 95% of Egyptians have a negative view towards the United States. These numbers are worse under Barack Obama, worse than they were under George Bush, worse than they were at the height of George Bush's lack of popularity in the Middle East. What happened? In other words, not only has nothing changed since 9/11, they're worse in every way that we thought we were going to get better. Every way, we've actually gotten worse. Well, these numbers, and we can thank James Zogby for these numbers actually come with very clear-cut explanation. People were asked what it is that has turned people away so much from the excitement of 2009. I mean, you can look at the red numbers, the 2009 numbers, as opposed to what we see now in 2011. And the answer has been pretty clear. By the way, this PowerPoint presentation is just in honor of being in the Silicon Valley, like the home of the PowerPoint presentation. This is just for you, Silicon Valley. Well, unfortunately, it's cut off at the top there, but it's okay. Number one, failed expectations. Failed expectations, the phrase that will probably go on Barack Obama's tombstone one day. Failed expectations. This is a man who came to office promising a lot, but who's done almost nothing that he said he would do. And that is regard to the war in Iraq, to the war on terror, to Guantanamo, you name it. The foreign policy that this administration has in the Middle East is almost indistinguishable from the foreign policy of the Bush administration, except in one way. The rhetoric is different. And for a long time, we thought that the rhetoric was enough. Turns out, people in the Arab world aren't stupid. They actually know the difference between words and actions. They like the words, but they don't notice the actions. Not a single Arab country did Barack Obama's approval rating go above 10%. Why? It's the exact same arguments that have been made for decades. America's interference, its support for dictatorships, its lack of support for democracy, which I just want to make this clear, and that's why I put this bold in here. You know, for those of you who hear, you know, these sort of experts constantly talking about democracy in the Middle East and how, you know, it's not a big deal, I think this should say all you need to know. 9 Arab states, democracy was not only at the highest levels as far as people's aspirations, but it was higher priority than anything else, than civic infrastructure, higher than better education, higher than fair wages. Those of you who keep constantly hearing that what we're seeing in the Middle East is not a democratic revolution, it's a revolution for social equality, economic equality. Yeah, that has something to do with it, but make no mistake, this is about democracy. That's what it's about. And the haphazard response of the United States sitting on the sidelines during the Egyptian revolution, turning the other way as the Saudis mow people down on the streets of Bahrain, a foreign country, and doing nothing about it. That kind of hypocrisy, it turns out, kind of gets noticed by the people of the region. And of course, key to all this, by an overwhelming margin, is the fact that for the people of the region, again, despite all you keep hearing about how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict doesn't really matter anymore, that people in the region don't really care anymore, turns out that's not the case. It is still the number one priority, the number one thing that keeps this region from thinking positively about the United States is our absolutely blind, suicidal support for the Israeli government, particularly this right-wing Likud government. And in this regard, with this last section here, as I have said many times, and I am not ashamed or embarrassed to say so, in this last point, Barack Obama has been the single worst president in modern history. No president in modern history has done more to set the Israeli-Palestinian conflict back than Barack Obama. Worse than Bush. Way worse than Bush. At least with George Bush, you knew what you were getting. George Bush's policy was very, very simple. Israel can do whatever it wants, whenever it wants. The end. And so when Bush, in the last couple of years of his administration, actually began to push for a two-state solution, when he became the first president in history to actually say the words Palestinian state in a sentence, yes, that's true, George Bush, first president to ever say the words Palestinian state, then it actually meant something. But for Barack Obama to come to power, promising that he was going to be different, that he was going to create this new way of approaching the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He was going to be a neutral mediator who's going to force both sides to make the compromises necessary, and then to lay down like a milquetoast in the way that he has in this administration, to be repeatedly embarrassed on the global stage, to be mocked by the Israeli Prime Minister in the US House of Congress, no less, and to just keep taking it and taking it. Not only has he utterly destroyed any hope for peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, not only has he put an end, and I will go so far as to say that generations from now, when we talk about the fact that the two-state solution came and went, we will thank Barack Obama for it. And now he's going to dare stand alone amongst 272 nations and say that the Palestinians should not have a state because it should be negotiated with Israel, as though we're talking about two equal parties negotiating with each other. How does an ant negotiate with a person? That's the difference in power between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That's what we have with our foreign policy. Worse. Not better, not the same, worse today than it was 10 years ago. That's just foreign policy. Have I depressed you yet? Because it's going to get worse. That's just foreign policy. With regard to domestic policy, it's been a completely different issue. Remember I was telling you that part of that process, you know, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there was this incredible fear about this onslaught, this overwhelming backlash against Muslims in this country that never actually happened. On the contrary, one of the things that I think was most remarkable about the months after 9/11 was the fact that not just our political leaders, but our religious leaders really kept this sort of wave of Islamophobia from gripping this country. Certainly not in the way that it gripped Europe. What we were seeing in Europe, where you have these, you know, isolated, ethnically segregated Muslim communities who don't have the same rights and privileges, who are completely ostracized and marginalized from society, when you have laws being passed in European countries, actual laws being passed, stripping Muslims of the same rights and privileges that every other religious community in Europe gets, That was something that we all thought is just something that would never happen in the United States. And yet here we are. We're at a position now in which anti-Muslim sentiment in this country is higher than it has ever been. Far, far higher than it was in the immediate aftermath of September 11th. Half of Americans, 50% of this country, has a negative view towards Islam. 1 out of 3 Americans believes that Muslims should be forced to carry special IDs, identifying themselves as Muslims. That's 100 million people in this country. We are seeing certain things, certain images, certain events in this country that hearken to the worst parts of our past. Events that we thought we would never, ever see again in this country. This is next to me, Temecula. These are women and children entering a house of worship. Scenes from America's past that we thought we would never see again are becoming so commonplace, so mainstream now, that it's accepted. The man who just won the Florida straw poll, Herman Cain, a man who has promised as part of his political platform, he has actually promised, he has said the words, "Elect me president and I will discriminate against Muslims." This is a man who wants the job of enforcing the Constitution. Here's an idea. Read the Constitution first. And yet, not only is he standing in front of a GOP audience, he actually won the Florida poll today. Now, okay, he's not going to be president, let's be honest. Okay, we're not going to have a pizza guy be our president, but that's not the point. The point is that the very idea that he belongs on that stage is something that would have been inconceivable 4 years ago, inconceivable 8 years ago, and yet it's completely commonplace today. Why? What's happened? I mean, make no mistake, there have always been these sort of fringe characters. Okay, that's not what I'm talking about. It's not like there was no anti-Muslim sentiment in the country until a few years ago. Of course not. But those characters have always been sort of on the fringes. You know, these anti-Muslim zealots are all people that no one ever bothered taking seriously anymore. And people like Robert Spencer, you know, who runs Jihad Watch, and I'm pretty sure has a crush on me. You know, if you believe that the decision by Campbell Soup to issue a line of halal soups is the first sign of the Muslim takeover of America, you're a moron. There's no reason to take you seriously. You're an idiot. Okay? You don't belong at the table. That's, by the way, what Robert Spencer said. By the way, what I love about that is like the idea that somehow, you know, there are a bunch of Muslims in a dark room somewhere going, you know how we should take over? Soup. So 1 can of soup at a time, and then it'll be ours. Idiot. Or people like Pamela Geller, you know, I mean, if Pamela Geller, you know, can say with a straight face that Barack Obama is the bastard Muslim love child of Malcolm X, you're out of the conversation at that point. That's it. No reason to take you seriously again. Those people have always existed. And we don't have to take them seriously. They're clowns. You know, we should be laughing at them. I mean, that's the proper response to a clown, is laughter. But what's remarkable over these last few years is how quickly that kind of fringe sentiment has become so mainstream. Again, that's what's changed in the last few years since 9/11. So, yes, okay, you've got Herman Cain. No, don't need to take Herman Cain seriously. But what about Newt Gingrich? How do you explain someone like Newt Gingrich? Who also, by the way, will not be president, but that's not the point. Newt Gingrich, the scion of the Republican Party, who has said that the first thing that he's going to do when he's elected president is he's going to push through a constitutional amendment banning the Sharia. Banning Sharia in America, a constitutional amendment, banning Sharia. That's a little bit like passing a law forbidding Americans from riding unicorns. You know, we already have a constitutional amendment banning Sharia. It's called the Constitution. We've got laws. But that's the kind of rhetoric that you're hearing in the mainstream now. Now, there are a lot of reasons, social, economic, political reasons for this. I've talked about this ad nauseum. Many of you have heard me talk about this. I mean, we have to keep in mind that, you know, the economy plays a role in all of this. In times of economic distress, it's perfectly normal for Americans to look to some kind of scapegoat, someone upon whom they can throw their fears and anxieties. And as I've said before, in this current climate, you know, the scapegoat of choice is either, depending on where you live, Muslims or Mexicans. Those are the two, you know, groups that have become demonized in this country. So if you happen to be a Mexican Muslim, you're in trouble. My advice to you is to just stay home, just, you know, wait till this thing blows over. But the economy, let's be serious. The economy plays a role in all of this. I think we also have to take very seriously this sense of war weariness that has descended upon a lot of Americans. I love watching these GOP debates and having Ron Paul stand up there and condemn the wars and have a room full of Republicans actually applaud. I mean, it's like your brain starts to, you know, kind of like spin around. Like, what the hell? When you hear a room full of Republicans saying that the war should be over and the military should come home, you know that the country's pretty much had enough. That sense of rah-rah patriotism that got us into these two wars without any questions asked has been replaced with the reality of trillions of dollars spent and hundreds of thousands of lives ended. And I think a lot of people are wondering, what do we get? What do we get from that? Obama just not too long ago told us that the Iraq war is over. Really? So what happened? What do we get from that? That, I think, plays a huge role in this sort of rising anti-Muslim sentiment for sure. And, to be perfectly honest, this notion that, you know, the American Muslim community, because they're so wealthy, they're so well integrated, they're so much a part of the American cultural landscape that they just simply are going to be immune to the kind of radicalization or extremist ideologies that have really taken hold amongst European communities, that couldn't happen here in this country. It turns out that's not the case. The great fear of homegrown terrorism has, over the last couple of years, become a reality. And there have been a number of cases in which American Muslims have been either caught planning attacks or have actually carried those attacks out. Now, by no means is this a trend, and nobody in the FBI, nobody in the intelligence community thinks that this is a trend, but it still has brought to attention this sort of nagging fear that was very much a part of the cultural dialogue after 9/11, that maybe there is this sort of homegrown threat of terrorism. All of that plays a role. All of that is important. But we now know, thanks to the incredible research done by the Center for American Progress, that this rise in anti-Muslim sentiment in this country is not an accident. It's not a grassroots phenomenon. I want to emphasize this as clearly as I can. It's not a natural phenomenon. It's not as though people just sort of slowly started to realize that Islam is an enemy and that Muslims can't be trusted. That's not what happened. On the contrary, this was a well-funded, well-researched, well-organized cabal of individuals and organizations that have been funded to the tune of $40 million with the sole purpose of convincing Americans that Islam is the enemy. This was deliberately done. I mean, let's be clear here. If you hear a housewife from Missouri talking about taqiyya, that didn't come to her on her own, okay? All right? If you hear, her talking about the problem of Sharia, trust me, she doesn't have a clue what Sharia means. She's regurgitating information, she's regurgitating catchphrases that were taught to her by this cabal. The Center for American Progress has put together this really, I mean, I think perfectly outlined graph about how this works. 7 organizations, 7 foundations, and those are the names right there, which have, over the last decade, given $42.5 million to these organizations. Frank Gaffney, Daniel Pipes, David Yerushalmi, Robert Spencer, as I mentioned, Steve Emerson. Just a handful of organizations, anti-Muslim zealot organizations. And these people, I mean, people like Robert Spencer, people like Frank Gaffney, Steve Emerson, these are the zealots, these are the fringe people that I was talking about before that have suddenly become mainstream. It's amazing, with $40 million, it puts you right into the mainstream. What do? They use this money to write reports, to do this sort of pseudo-scientific research, this pseudo-scholarship about the threat from Islam. And those reports get fed right into the echo chamber. They go right into the media, and by which I mean Fox News. That's what I'm talking about when I say media. And a certain group of politicians who are willing to just regurgitate this information because it came from a think tank. It's scholarly work. And then it becomes part of the entire sort of general popular view of what Islam is and what Muslims are. So how does this work? I'll give you an example of this. So let's say the Sharia, right? The Sharia hysteria. Muslims want to force Americans to live under Sharia. The 1% of the population of America that's Muslim is about to take over the entire Constitution and force everyone in this country to wear hijabs and be stoned to death. Okay? It's happening, people. It's happening. I mean, didn't you see the Campbell soup? It's happening. Wake up. So, these organizations give a couple of $1 million to people like Frank Gaffney, to people like David Yerushalmi, especially David Yerushalmi, who's responsible, single-handedly responsible for crafting the framework, the language for the 23 states in this country that are currently debating legislation banning Sharia in the United States. He writes the reports, he sends it off to Fox News about the creeping Islamization of America, the Shariaization of America, and then the news picks it up, and then next thing you know, there's the middle-aged housewife in Missouri talking about the threat of Sharia. Sharia's coming to get you. I'll show you a video of how this works. Think Progress put this together, so you get it. I want to make sure you understand completely what's going on here and how this process works.
It's kind of a stealth effort to bring about the same thing that the Al-Qaeda's and the violent kinds of jihadists have in mind as well, a triumph of this Sharia program in America.
Sharia has come to the West. Sharia has come to America.
It's a desire to spread Islam gradually. It's a belief in the Sharia, the code of Islamic law.
Muslims are the first immigrant group that have come to this country with a ready-made model of society and governance that they believe to be superior.
And the Sharia is deeply anti-democratic. It presumes autocratic rulers and submissive subjects. It emphasizes God's will over popular sovereignty and encourages violent jihad to expand Islam's borders.
And we have produced a document which we call Sharia, the Threat to America.
Well, a panel of national security experts now sounding the alarm on Sharia law, saying the Obama administration is ignoring the threat of radical Islamic law and its links to terrorism.
I mean, probably much of what we've said sounds incredible. That's very dangerous, is that it is being done stealthily in a way that's below the radar horizon, as they say, incrementally.
They've not done their research on this imam that wants Sharia law, America to be more Sharia compliant. His comments that he made after 9/11.
Well, I want to ask you, there are places here in America where people are saying we need to have Sharia law.
There's also a fear of creeping Sharia, the slow but steady influence of Sharia Muslim law into America.
We must come together and understand that there is an infiltration of the Sharia practice into all of our operating systems here in this country, as well as we see across Western civilization.
The biggest shock out of all this is that the women's liberation groups have not just gone berserk over this creep into our society that diminishes women as it does.
Yeah, this creep of Sharia law you're talking about, Congressman Louis Gohmert. This Sharia law business is crap. It's just crazy. And I'm tired of dealing with the crazies.
Governor Christie, thank you very much. The money goes into the pot. The fake report gets written. The report goes on Fox News, and I mean Fox News. I'm not just making this up. Fox News. In fact, this same Public Religion Research Institute did this poll where they discovered that the greatest determinant to your negative views on Islam is whether you watch Fox News. And by the way, these numbers, the Fox News numbers, are far higher than they are for Republicans who don't watch Fox News, Tea Party members who don't watch Fox News. In other words, it's not your religion, it's not your ethnicity, it's not your politics that decides that's the greatest determinant about your views about Islam, is if you watch Fox News. One news channel. And this is how it works. So, I want to make sure that everybody understands that this is not an accident. This is not a natural, phenomenon that just arose out of nowhere. This is a well-funded cabal whose sole purpose is to create the impression that Islam is the enemy, and it's worked. It's worked brilliantly. In fact, it's worked so well that the same phenomenon that has happened in Europe over the last 2-3 decades, the otherization of Islam, the attempt to define oneself, to define one's own national identity, a collective identity in opposition to Muslims, has now taken place in the United States. This is the reality of the American Muslim community, the reality of the American Muslim community, a community that is incredibly wealthy. The advertising giant JWT puts the annual disposable income for American Muslims at $170 billion. $170 billion a year in disposable income for that 1% of the population that's Muslim. Huge levels of satisfaction, which actually may indicate that Muslims are a little bit insane. I mean, if you really are this satisfied with how things are going with America, maybe there is something wrong, actually. Very much the same with regard to sort of the general issues. This kind of reminds me of, I don't know if you ever read Us Magazine. I don't read Us Magazine. I'm just saying that some people read Us Magazine. But it's like, you know what I'm talking about? The stars, they're just like us. It's like, Muslims, they're just like us. They recycle paper. They play video games. In fact, the thing that's really fascinating is that despite this idea about how Muslims are the first generation who come here and they don't really absorb into American society, the highest level of citizenship amongst any other immigrant community, period. The highest levels of education and literacy amongst any immigrant community. In fact, the second highest education levels of any religious group in the United States. This is the reality of the American Muslim community. When it comes to issues of violence, right? Muslims are the enemy, they're coming to get you. Well, Gallup just released a poll last week that really, I think, began to blow people's minds. They asked a lot of questions, but this is the one that got the most attention. Do you believe that attacks on civilians are ever justified? 78% of Muslims said they are never justified. That's 20% higher than Protestants and Catholics, more than Jews, more than Mormons, more than atheists. This had a lot of people scratching their heads in this country. I mean, by far, the largest percentage of any religious group in the United States. These are the extremists, right? This is the threat that we're facing here. It's not about these facts. That's the thing that I'm trying to emphasize. It's not about who Muslims are or what Muslims believe. It's the attempt to paint them as other, as opposite, as foreign, as exotic, as different, as not us. The best example of this, I've talked about this before numerous times, is good old Barack Obama, right? Nearly 1 in 5 Americans believes that Barack Obama is a Muslim. And while that, of course, is a ridiculous number, what's even more ridiculous is how much higher it is than when he was first elected. More people today believe that Obama is a Muslim than they did when he was elected. The thing that's really fascinating about this poll is that the link between your views about Obama's, being a Muslim or not, is intimately tied to how you see his domestic policy. In other words, the more you disagree with his policies, the more likely you are to think he's a Muslim. Don't like the healthcare law? You probably think he's a Muslim. Don't like his financial regulation laws? You probably think he's a Muslim. In other words, Islam is not, it's not a specific thing anymore. It's not a sort of a specific people or a specific religion that is being reacted against. It's just the new code word for other. Whatever is foreign, whatever is exotic, whatever is unfamiliar, whatever is frightening, is being tagged as Islam. Hence the Sharia hysteria, which is ridiculous. 99% of the people who are talking about their fear of Sharia don't have a damn clue what Sharia means. I've studied Sharia for 18 years. I barely understand what it means. But it's not about what it means. It's just a code word for that which is not us. This, if you've ever, seen me talk, or if you've ever, read anything, I never get tired of saying this. This is not new. This is an old story in this country. We've seen this otherization of religious communities in this country. It's part of who we are. The thing about the American identity is that it opens itself up precisely to this otherization because unlike many other nation states, certainly unlike most of Europe, we're a country in which ethnicity and nationality don't mean the same thing. We are a country that doesn't define ourselves as a collective based on a common ethnicity, or a common culture, or a common language, or a common religion. We don't have any of those things in common because a country of immigrants can't define itself in that way. Instead, it has to define itself by linking together a group of shared values, political principles, an idea of what this country means. So if you accept that idea, if you absorb that idea into your own, you're part of this country. It's a beautiful notion. It's a wonderful notion. It's why this is the greatest country. But the problem, however, is that in times of societal stress, in times of social ruptures, whether it be economic crises or political crises, or in times in which the racial landscape of the country is changing rapidly, as we're seeing today, or the political culture is changing rapidly, any time there is some kind of massive societal stress in society, we need to find someone to define ourselves against. Today it's Muslims. In the 1920s, it was the Jews. The Jews, after a wave of Jewish immigration into this country during the interwar period, the anti-Semitism in this country was higher than you could possibly imagine. You think Muslims have it bad now, you have no idea. We had politicians like Louis McFadden openly talking about the Jewish conspiracy to take over America's financial infrastructure. People like Henry Ford. Henry Ford, the great, modern businessman genius and despicable anti-Semite. This is one of Henry Ford's many, many newspapers that published the Protocols of Zion. The international Jew, the world's problem. This was the front page headline of one of Henry Ford's newspapers. You had universities like Harvard, Yale, Columbia actually issue quotas about how many Jews they would let in every year, because as they put it, they didn't want to infect the student body. This was only 80 years ago. It was not that long ago. The Congress at that time passed a law called the Johnson-Reed Act, specifically limiting Jewish immigration into this country. You had religious leaders like Father Charles Coughlin. Some of you guys remember this from American history. Father Charles Coughlin, who in the 1930s really became the sort of focal point of Christian anti-Semitism. This is a man who referred to the Jews as Christ killers. This is a man who actually started an organization called the Christian Front, which the FBI shut down when they realized that they were stockpiling weapons to kill Jews. Charles Coughlin. And now, of course, these arguments that these guys made, that the Jews were foreign, that they're exotic, that they're not like us, they don't act like us, they don't pray like us, they don't dress like us, they're different, they're un-American. Of course, we look back on that argument and we just laugh. It's ridiculous. It's absurd. No one takes that seriously anymore. We think of it with shame and with derision. We mock them because, again, they deserve our mockery. Exact same thing happened to the American Catholic community in the 19th century. This is a poster for an organization called the Know-Nothings, a political movement called the Know-Nothings in the late 19th century. A political party that arose under the single banner of stopping Catholic immigration into the United States. In fact, they actually ran their own president, the nominee for president, Millard Fillmore, who had already been president once. Apparently it went so well, they thought they would try it again. That's a Fillmore joke. Millard Fillmore joke? No? No Millard Fillmore fans? No? Okay, that's fine. The Know-Nothings, they called themselves. Again, the idea was that by definition, Catholicism was anti-democratic. That you cannot be an American and a Catholic. You can't serve two masters. After all, the Catholics have their own laws, canon law, just like the Jews have their own laws, halakha. And so in a sense, by definition, if you were Catholic, you can't possibly be an American citizen. You're different. You're not like us. Foreign, exotic. And yet again, we look back on this time, we look back on these people with shame and with derision. And that's, of course, exactly how we are going to look back on the anti-Muslim zealots of today. The next generation is going to look back at Herman Cain and Newt Gingrich and just go, what the hell? I mean, they're going to look at Robert Spencer, they're going to look at Frank Gaffney, and they're going to laugh. Just like we laugh at them. That's guaranteed. It's guaranteed. That's how this country works. Don't worry, we'll find somebody else to define ourselves against by then. Someone else will take the Muslims' role. But the notion that Islam is not part of the American cultural fabric, that's just going to go away. Just as it did with Catholics, just as it did with Jews, with Mormons, the list goes on and on and on. We know that that's what's going to happen. The question is, how do we get there? What do we do to get to that point? Well, I think it's very important. I mean, I've been misquoted a little bit on this part. I just want to make it as clear as I possibly can. I think education is very, very important. It's very important that people learn about Islam, learn about Muslim ideas, Muslim practices, Muslim people. I mean, someone has to be able to respond to the idiocy that people like, Glenn Beck spout. Someone has to be able to say, actually, that's nonsense. That's not the case. Education is important. As an educator, I'm actually contractually obligated to say that. I have to say education. But this is how I make my living. I make my living talking and educating people. I mean, that's why I write books. You know, Hamid talked about Aslan Media. This is my nonprofit. I mean, the whole point of this is to have a clearinghouse where people can come and learn about the art and culture, film, music, politics, faith of the Middle East and the larger Muslim world. So I am not here denigrating the importance of education. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is it's not enough. That's what I'm saying. It's not enough. I mean, if you think that you can change Americans' minds by just sort of educating them about Islam, you have no idea who you're talking about. Education is not a top priority of the people in this country. Am I blowing your minds? Do you not know this at all? In fact, what really matters is relationships. That says knowledge versus relationships right there, actually. It's relationships that matter. Let me ask you this. Do you think that the Jews, despite making up 2% of the population of this country, just 2%, do you think that they have become such an integral part of the American cultural and political and religious landscape because they taught Americans about Judaism? Are you serious? I mean, I think pretty much the sum and total of what most Americans know about Judaism, they learn on Seinfeld. Okay? People have no idea what Judaism is. They don't have a clue what Judaism is at all. That's not what happened. Do you think that the Catholics became a part of this, cultural landscape by teaching people about Catholicism? Of course not. People have no clue what Catholicism actually is, what Catholic beliefs and practices entail, except for what they see on television or in movies. No, it wasn't just about educating people, it was about becoming a part of the system in its totality. It's about being political and business and cultural and artistic and literary leaders. That's what Jews and Catholics did, Jews especially. I mean, it's remarkable that 2% of the population of this entire country has so utterly infused the very cultural fabric of the United States with Jewish ideas, Jewish philosophy, Jewish culture, Jewish humor, Jewish literature. I mean, if you look at this whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict thing that I was talking about, the fact that we are really, again, just absolutely destroying our entire global position because of the votes of 2% of this population tells you all you need to know about the power that the American Jewish community has. Because why? Because they just put their head down, they pushed aside the anti-Semitism that was forced upon them, and they got to the business of just becoming part of the American community, the American landscape. 60% of Americans say they've never met a Muslim. 60%, which again, I really just have a really hard time. I mean, have you been to a doctor? Have you gone to a dentist lately? Just chances are he's a Muslim. And yet, 45% of Americans say they know everything there is to know about Islam and Muslims. Now, of course, what they mean is what Fox News told them about Islam and Muslims. It's not enough, unfortunately, just to tell them about Islam. As I said, part of the reason why I was really excited to come here and why I was committed to do so, despite the fact that my wife isn't all that happy with me right now, is because I really believe in what ISF is doing. Yeah, look, we've done a great job. Muslims, hey, well done making money, okay? You guys have, we did it, okay? We did what, I mean, this is what we do. Immigrants, 60% of Muslims are immigrants. That's what immigrants do, right? They put their head their nose to the grind and they just, they make money. We did it. We're rich. Well done. But if we actually want to change the perceptions of Muslims in this country, if we want to change America's foreign policy for the better, if we want to go back 10 years ago to 9/11 and actually make good on the promises of that tragic day. The promise of unity, the promise of global awareness, the promise of that 9/11 generation. If we want to change the domestic policy of this country, then it's not just about doing it by becoming, rich tech guys and engineers and doctors. Great, fantastic. If you're a doctor or a tech guy, good for you. But unless we are willing to become part of the cultural climate, the political climate, the literary climate, if we're not going to insert ourselves into Hollywood, if we're not going to insert ourselves into the media, then other people are going to write the narrative for us. It's as simple as that. That's what we're facing here. That's why I think it's so important to support organizations like ISF. By the way, I think it's hilarious that we actually need an organization like ISF. I mean, I think it's just awesome that we have to actually force our kids to study literature and the arts. I think that's hilarious. But that's where we are. And it's that generation, the generation that we are building now, that's going to be responsible to take us to where we know we're going to be. We know where we're going to end up. The future is written. The question is, how do we get there and who takes us there? And that's why I think this evening is so important. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your deeply insightful presentation. I'm sure we all learned something from this. So this is the beginning of our question and answer session, and they were passing out cards at the hallway. So again, don't be shy, write your questions, and if you're not shy, if you want to get up and say something, please let us know. We'll pass the mic to you. So while that's getting collected, I'm going to ask the first question. So I assume based on that speech that you have no political ambitions.
I have absolutely no political ambitions whatsoever. Look, I think it's important that people from our culture, and our ethnicity and our faith communities, that they run for office, both local office and state and national office. I think it's very important. We have to be part of the political dialogue. That said, I can't think of a more useless thing to be than a politician. I mean, so someone asked me if I wanted to run for Congress. You've got to be kidding. Why? I mean, first of all, I'm of the opinion that the entire lower house of Congress should just be wiped out. I mean, it's just like a cesspool of wasted space is what the lower house of Congress is. The idea of being a part of it makes my skin crawl. But you don't have to be a political force in this country. I mean, you can be, what I mean to say is, you can be a political force in this country without being a politician. I mean, if you've spent time in D.C., I interned there for a long time, I go there, I go to D.C. a lot. The people who actually have the power in D.C. are not the politicians. It's the lobbyists that have the power. It's the people in the background, the staff, that have the power. I mean, when you watch these people, when you watch these politicians stand on the floor of Congress and spout their nonsense, you don't actually think they wrote that, do you? You don't actually think they formed that opinion themselves, do you? Of course not. They have a very, very strong group of staffers who do their thinking for them. I've met these people, they're fantastic. Even if you disagree with them, they're very, very smart people. They do all the thinking for them. A politician is just a voice recorder. You push play and he spouts the nonsense. That's what he does. So I think that it's very important for us to have a place at the political table. I just want to make sure that you understand that that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to run for political office. You can have far, far more political power running an NGO or a lobbying organization, or even working in the background, being a staffer, than you would have certainly being a congressman. Yeah, just I have nothing good to say about the lower house of Congress.
Well, this might be actually tied to that. So there's a question that was asked when Barack Obama controlled both houses. Why do you think it was that he didn't necessarily either push his agenda through when he could have, and if you think there's some conspiracy theories associated with that, you can say it.
This is a question that, I mean, way smarter people than me are having trouble answering. What happened to Barack Obama? What happened to this man who ran one of the bravest, boldest campaigns in modern political history, and then became this spineless pushover for whom the notion of compromise means basically just giving in completely? I don't understand it. I think the debt ceiling thing was a perfect example of what's happened here. Barack Obama wanted compromise, and so the Republican position was give us everything and we'll raise the debt ceiling, which of course, as most of you know, is an automatic thing. We've done it 30 times in the last couple of decades. We did it 8 times just in President Bush's office. It's not even a law. You don't even have to have a vote. You can write one single sentence on a budget line item and just send that off. That's how automatic the raising of the debt ceiling is. And so when the other side says that what we're willing to give you is nothing. I mean, it's raising the debt ceiling. It's what we were going to do anyway. And in return, you give us everything you want. For the president to call that compromise is absurd. So why has this happened? I have no idea. I don't have an explanation for Obama's utter spinelessness when it comes to confronting his political opponents. What I think is worse, however, is the spinelessness, as I said, that he's shown with regard to foreign policy. I actually was in Jerusalem at that moment in which Vice President Joe Biden touched down in order to restart the peace process talks, and the day that he actually landed was the day in which the Israeli government approved 1,600 settlement units. So Joe Biden was there in order to begin a process that starts with the freezing of settlement activity, and the day that he lands, the Israeli government approved 1,600 new settlement units. That kind of global spit in the face to the person who's supposed to be the most powerful man on earth, the President of the United States, from a country that gets $3 billion a year in aid from us, is everything you need to know about how the world sees Barack Obama. I want to make this as clear as possible. The world thinks Obama is a joke. They think he's a joke. The fact that they think that he could do anything on the international stage. If you saw Mahmoud Abbas's speech at the UN, and you saw 272 delegations stand up and applaud him, and one delegation, Susan Rice, the American delegation, sitting down with her arms crossed and a scowl on her face, then you know how the rest of the world thinks about the United States of America. There's a reason why our popularity is lower today than even in the days of George Bush. It's because people look at this president and they just laugh. They think he's spineless, they think he's a pushover, they don't take him seriously. That's a problem for our national security, okay? This isn't a Democrat, Republican, it's not an Israeli-Palestinian thing, okay? If you actually like America, if you want America to be successful, then you should be worried. Because if we, as the most powerful nation on earth, is seen throughout the rest of the country as a laughingstock, as a lapdog to the Israeli Prime Minister, that is disastrous for our national security interests. But I'm telling you now, that's how the world sees us.
So there was a question asked. Thank you. There was a question asked. I'm going to give my own preface to it. So the unfortunate reality, which kind of ties to what you were saying in your presentation, is that there is no political penalty for being anti-Islam. There's actually political brownie points versus other organizations. So the day that we actually see politicians coming to our towns and lobbying to win our votes, that's really the litmus test for seeing this movement turn around. So the question was that how do we continue to improve the mobilization of Muslims on the voting side of the world? Because I think we need to wake up and be more politically active.
Yeah, look, I think this is absolutely true, but let's be honest, there are only 3 million of us. So 3 million votes is not that big of a deal. I mean, no one's going to bend over backwards for the votes of 3 million people. They're not. But we are absurdly rich. And in this country, your money is your voice. By the way, I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean quite literally in this country, according to the Supreme Court, your money is your voice. So the real problem isn't mobilization, isn't get out the vote. Getting out the vote for 3.5 million people, I'm sorry, it's not going to do much. The real issue is the pocketbooks. You want politicians to pay a price for the words that they say, you use your money to do that. When you recognize that, as I say, the annual disposable income of this community is $170 billion, you can turn away from 3 million votes. You cannot turn away from $170 billion. And yet, what I think is really depressing is the fact that we haven't used that money, and that also includes our activism. I mean, because that's really what we're talking about. They're intimately linked. We haven't used that money as a voice, either in the political realm or in the commercial realm. I mean, something really interesting happened if you guys were paying attention. This was sort of this awesome moment in my life when I realized how much power you can have through Twitter. If you recall, a couple of weeks ago, like about a month ago, Whole Foods had this entire campaign, this Ramadan campaign that they were running, where they had all these halal foods and these Ramadan signs, and it was a great idea. I mean, the truth is that there are a lot of Muslims. They're very rich. They tend to buy. I mean, if you can afford Whole Foods, I mean, really, my wife calls it whole paycheck foods. And yet, what happened was that a group of these anti-Muslim zealots began blogging and writing letters to Whole Foods, basically saying, Whole Foods supports terrorism, because that's what Ramadan is, terrorism. And so Whole Foods, the Houston office of Whole Foods, sent out an email basically telling the Whole Food chains to do away with the Ramadan campaign. This was like on a Thursday morning when the email went out. That email, of course, got picked up on Twitter, and we started this entire campaign, on Whole Foods. And by the afternoon, Whole Foods had released a press release saying that the campaign is on, there's nothing to worry about. In fact, they're going to redouble their efforts. And as they put it to a reporter from Mother Jones, the branch that sent out the email is being dealt with, is how they put it. That's how it works. I mean, I hate to be, so blunt and grotesque as to say it's all about money, but it's all about money. You do know what country you live in, right? It's about money. And if you're not willing to put your money where your views are, where your mouth is, then no one's going to pay any attention to you. But you show up and be a financial power and see if a politician dares to say certain things about you. See if a corporation dares to say certain things about you. They don't. That's the important thing. Yes, mobilization, activism, that already exists in our community, but it's about putting your money in these causes, making sure that your voice is being heard through your pocketbooks.
And that is something that we still need to realize. You can get a face-to-face dinner with any politician at an openly publicized price. It's not a secret, it's not bribery. They'll announce it. You want dinner with Dianne Feinstein? There's a price for it.
Oh yeah, we did. I mean, in fact, we did this with Nancy Pelosi not too long ago. I mean, these politicians have a price. We'll give you $150,000 and you come to our fundraiser. And I can tell you that every time that we need anything from Nancy Pelosi, we just call now. Hi, remember us? $150,000? That's how it works.
The gentleman over there with a question. Do you need a mic or you have a loud voice?
No, I'm okay, thank you. Actually, you brought a very good idea about how we can defend Islam. I think what we need to do now is to attack, like we just said in the last segment. The problem is we've been spending too much time in defending. There's no reason for defending anymore. Like instead of mocking between us here about certain group, why don't we go outside and find some media to mark this so everybody laugh at it? We need to do that. But also the major important thing is we need to find ways to communicate together. We still bring our problem from back home and we have this issue. Once we need to talk together and we organize ourselves, it will be completely different.
I think you're right, but I will say, just to add to that, that's not a problem I actually see in the younger generation, to be honest with you. I mean, young people in this country, young Muslims in this country, don't really have the same, sort of political and ethnic hang-ups, sectarian hang-ups that, some of our parents have. I mean, maybe it's because I spend so much time on college campuses, but part of the reason why I feel so optimistic and positive about the path that this country is on is precisely because I get to hang out with these young people. So no, I think you're absolutely right. And the other thing too about young people that I just love is that there's this sort of sense of entitlement that they have. That our parents' generations do not have very much. I think my dad is here. Is that you, Dad? I think maybe. Anyway, but I got a funny story about my dad. If that is my dad. If it's not my dad, I apologize, sir. After 9/11, I was living in Iowa at the time, and I came home to visit. And I pull up to the front of the house, and there's just this like gigantic American flag. And I mean, we're Americans and stuff, but giant American flag on the front porch, not really our thing. And I went in and I said to my dad, I was like, what is the deal with the giant American flag on the front lawn? And he said, they're watching. So, of course, this is a man who grew up in a police state, right? As a lot of our parents did. You don't get that from young people. I mean, there is this sort of sense of entitlement as American citizens. Damn it, this is what I deserve, and there's nobody who's going to take it away from me. That I think is cause for optimism.
We have time for 2 questions. I have like 15 cards in my hand, so... When? Oh, there you are. Go ahead, get up.
I'll stand up. So you're saying we have $100 billion worth. Why haven't we put money into certain campaigns and groups and lobbyists? And then going to the brothers case, he makes a very good point about we're always thinking about ourselves and our expatriatism. Like, oh, we're thinking about the Middle East. In my case, I grew up here. I don't care a little bit about that at all. I'd rather care about ourselves here and our image, because that reflects back to revolutions and stuff that's happening right now. So I don't know if you have any kind of thoughts and things that we could kind of focus on.
Look, I mean, in some ways you kind of answered the question yourself, is that we are so inwardly focused. We're so focused on the American dream, by which we mean the house and the cars and the success and all that stuff, which again is totally normal for first-generation immigrants. That's a completely natural state of affairs. The other problem, of course, is, and this goes back to exactly your point about always thinking about our home countries, etc., is that there is this impression that when we do give money, when we do give of our time, or when we do get engaged in political or social activism, it's always sort of about internal issues. It's always about communal issues, you know? As though like the only people who suffer in the world are Muslims. The only people who are hungry in the world are Muslims. You know, the only problem in the world are within Muslims. And that's, I think, a real mistake, because that creates precisely that isolation that makes people think that, you know, the Muslim community is not part of the American community. I mean, yes, it's true that, you know, Palestinians are suffering, but so are Rwandans, you know, so are people in San Salvador. So, I mean, we have to expand our horizons a little bit, you know, get involved in feeding the poor, in issues of environmentalism and global warming. Those are all aspects of being part of a globalized community that we have to start taking seriously. Why don't we give to you know, why don't we spend more of our money, and by the way, it's $170 billion, why don't we spend more money and more of our worth trying to affect politics? Well, again, I think it's a generational issue. Most of our parents came from countries in which there is no such thing as political participation. What do you mean? Like, I mean, just politics is what happens over there, and you do your best to try to avoid it as much as possible. And that's the kind of mindset that I think a lot of the older generation in the community has. Whereas the younger generation, of course, understands, you know, having grown up here, understands sort of the value and the purpose of the political process and how it does play a role in kind of reframing perceptions. So again, I think it's a generational issue that has to be addressed. So my advice to all the young people is go ask your parents for money.
And that's part and parcel with an integration message that's at the core of ISF. So I'm going to ask this question here. I think the person who wrote it is a doctor, because they have terrible handwriting. I'm a doctor.
Wait, there aren't any doctors in the audience.
Yeah. No. I'm not going to ask them to raise their hands. It says, you've talked about Islamic Reformation being an evolution from doctrinal absolutism to doctrinal relativism. What does that doctrinal relativism specifically mean? I assume this is something you reference in your book. Or what does it look like in life?
Wow, you guys, you sure you want to end on this one? Because this is a thick question, man. Yes, I do talk about.
This is a Cliff Note version.
I do talk about this in the book, and you know, you can read more about it. But I just want to emphasize what we mean when we say Reformation. Reformation means one thing and one thing only. It is the transference of religious authority from institutions to individuals. That's what Reformation means. It's what it's always meant. When we talk about the Jewish Reformation of first century Palestine, that's what we're referring to. The result from Temple Judaism to Rabbinic Judaism. When we talk about the Christian Reformation, 15th, 16th century Europe, that's what we mean. The transference of religious authority from the papal seat to individuals, which ultimately resulted in Protestantism. That process takes place in every institutionalized religion in the world, and it's a process that's been taking place within Islam for 100 years or more, really since the end of the 19th century. And the book talks about sort of the causes of that, etc., etc. But that's what I think is important to understand. By definition, if you are putting the power to define faith in the hands of individuals, you are going to open up a can of worms. That means that any individual has the right to interpret the faith for him or herself without mediation. That's a process that takes place, again, in all institutional religions. It's why there are tens of thousands of different sects of every religion that exist, including Islam. Doctrinal relativism means the living side by side, the coexistence of these multiple interpretations of Islam, in the same way that one sees the multiple interpretations of Judaism and Christianity and Buddhism and Jainism and Hinduism all living side by side. Now, this may freak some people out, because some people think that their interpretation of Islam is the only correct interpretation of Islam. Good for you. Okay? Except that you are living in a fantasy world. Whether you like it or not, there are 1.5 billion of you. And about 1 billion of them agree that their interpretation of Islam is the right interpretation of Islam, and your interpretation is incorrect. Too bad. Islam is not Catholicism. We don't have a pope. We don't have a centralized religious authority with the power to define what is and what is not proper Islamic belief, what is and what is not proper Islamic practice. Doesn't exist? It's never existed. Not since the time of the Prophet. That's never existed in Islam. The caliph, this thing that people are always talking about, the caliph, was a political office, not a religious office. It was never, ever a religious office. It had no religious authority whatsoever. There was one caliph, a very famous caliph that I write about, who actually tried to take religious authority. It did not work. It resulted in a pogrom, and by the time he died and his brother took over, that was the end of that experiment. So it's an inevitable fact of being a Muslim that nobody gets to tell you you're wrong. That's how this religion works. Some people think it's a problem. It may be a problem. I'm sure some people would love to have that just one pope, like some Muslim pope who gets to speak for everyone. It'd be great. You can't have anyone say that, Muslims don't stand up against violence, because we're like, no, the Muslim pope said so. Except that it doesn't happen. It doesn't work that way. And whether you like it or not, this is the reality. We are not moving towards doctrinal relativism. We're in doctrinal relativism. We're not looking forward to an Islamic Reformation. We've been living in the Islamic Reformation for 100 years. It's just time that we pay attention and notice it. Thank you, everyone.